Referred to the world's wealthiest people at one time or another as the 1%. And unfortunately, in the past 100 years, not much has changed about that 1%. They are kind of still at the top of the economic food chain. And a lot of times, what I've realized is that these people are coming across as maybe cheap or overly frugal. But really, is that what it is that's making or keeping them rich and the 1%? Let's break out the magnifying glass and take a look at the books, shall we? There's an old saying that says, if you want to know what a farmer was doing at the end of last season, well, all you really got to do is look in his field today. You see, if he was, busy planting cabbage, then today he's got a field full of cabbage. Well, the same is kind of true of our money. If you want to know what you were doing with your finances, all you really have to do is take a look at your finances today. And you will see if you've been overspending, if you have been indulging a little bit too much, if you're kind of always living at the edge, if you're not making enough. Well, all you really have to do is look at your finances and your bank statements today, and you will kind of know what you have been doing and not doing. When you take a look at the wealthy, a lot of times people say, well, they're just cheap. They're just overly frugal. They're cheapskates. They just save all their money. They make a lot of money and they don't spend a lot of money. So at the end of the day, really, what is it? Is it certain actions they're taking, or is it something else that they're doing that's making the difference? I have a couple of friends that I wanted to talk about today because they really help me illustrate this. One of them is no longer with us. He has passed away recently, but he almost lived to 100. So he did really good health-wise, and he did really good financially. When I say he did really good financially, I'm not talking 5, 6, 7 figures. I'm talking 9 figures net worth. And if you don't know what that means, that starts at 100 million. That figure. But we spent a lot of time together in the past 20 years, and he was what many people who knew him considered to be a cheapskate. People were just constantly referring to him as overly cheap and a cheapskate and just super tight with his money. And he's got all this money. Why does he need to, be like that? And one of the things he used to do that I thought was hilarious is we would go out to dinner. And no matter where it was, and no matter who was paying, whether I was paying or he was paying, he always would order the cheapest thing on the menu. But he would act like that's the thing he wanted the most, So we would go to this great restaurant, maybe a seafood place on the coast, and I would be looking forward to some, baked sea scallops and, some crab or something. And he, of course, would sit down and be like, oh, man, it's been so long since I've had a fish and chips. I got to have the fish and chips. And, of course, it's the cheapest thing on the menu. And I just thought this was hilarious. It's just how he was, and he would always do this regardless of where we went. But he wouldn't just do it at restaurants. I mean, he would do it everywhere. If we were going to the hardware store, if he had a project going on in his backyard, like, oh, I'm building a new shed for my wood pile, he would literally go over to the 2x4s, look at what they cost, and then he'd start talking to the salesperson and say, well, you wouldn't have any, seconds or throwaway stock or something you can't sell at full price. And next thing you know, he'd be behind the building of the warehouse, negotiating for 20 cents on the dollar on these studs that were, not fit to do much with. But somehow he would make it work. He literally was just always after the best deal possible. Growing up, I had a friend who was similar, and this is kind of like someone I've known almost my whole life. They're a family friend. And once again, they have a net worth approaching 9 figures, and they've done extremely well. I might add to the point that neither one of these gentlemen ever had some amazing, crazy job. By any standards of today, they had very normal jobs. And he would, kind of be the type of guy who bragged, who would say, oh my God, I just found this great deal on 2-ply toilet paper, but I managed to save the old spools and spool it into 2 rolls. I mean, this is literally like, I remember these stories growing up, which I thought were absolutely ridiculous, but it's one of the things that he did, that he was tight with money, and he would think he was saving money by turning 1 roll of toilet paper into 2. You've probably heard similar stories. But it got me thinking, because these gentlemen's net worths are so huge and so high and, living these amazing lives, really, but being considered by everyone they know as the most cheapest people they know. I thought, what is it that's really going on? Is it this tightness? Is it this frugality? Is it being cheap with money that's responsible for them being rich? Or was it a series of other chess moves? So I guess the short answer is no, it's not just the saving of money and being cheap, because you can only save so much. There's a limit to how much you can save, but see, there's no limit to how much you can earn. So how do they really do it, and what percentage of their wealth is responsible for the frugality, for the being cheap part? I basically ended up summing it up after kind of putting a magnifying glass on their life and really looking at how they lived, what they did, and their jobs, and what else they did to create this wealth. And I came up with 3 basic ideas that I think are the fundamentals, are the foundation of what they did to create this massive amount of wealth. First off, I want to say that being good with money is a byproduct of how they thought. In other words, they grew up in houses where money was very, very scarce. The number one thing they did was they were just good with money. Why were they good with money? Because they didn't want to waste it. And they used a very common sense approach to always saving as much as they can on every purchase. In other words, money's hard to come by. You're working for it. So why waste it on anything? And that's kind of like their baseline thinking. That would be number one. They just were good with money. And if you want to call it being cheap, if you want to call it being frugal, it's sort of like the underlying script that's running on everything they do. They just don't want to waste. Growing up, they had so little and came from very meager households. So when they did finally start to earn a little, even though it was just from a job, it just was from their job, they said, why waste it? So as an underlying rule, just being good with money, maybe people will think you are a little bit cheap. Maybe people will say that you are too frugal. But if you aren't frugal, you can't do the second thing that these gentlemen did, which is, even though they had a job and their job paid decent, it was just a job type job, something very normal that any of us could do. So what they did was they started businesses. Today, maybe you would call it a side hustle, right? They started a business, something on the side that they could do while they worked their job. So they went to work, they saved their money because they were good with money, because they were tight with money, because they have that underlying script that runs all the time that just says, don't waste, don't spend too much money. It's really just common sense thinking. And you can call it what you want, but they were able to save enough from working a regular job that they were able to then put the money into a business. Now, I'm not going to tell you what their businesses were, but they were also very common businesses. And you could do a common business. A business doesn't have to be you start a Google or you end up running the next IBM. That doesn't have to be your business. It could be that you have a partner who comes to you and says, hey, I've always wanted to have a coffee shop. Would you like to go in on it with me? Maybe. They could have an idea. They could be struggling to put together an invention. I mean, maybe the idea is something that they don't have the money to do, but you could partner in that way. Maybe you're the money person. Maybe you put up the money and they have the idea. Maybe it's, I want to do funny t-shirts, or I want to sell widgets online, or whatever it is, but you could just be the money behind it. I've seen people just buy and sell things online. I mean, a lot of people, they just start a little business where maybe they're selling something on Etsy or eBay or Amazon or even Craigslist. Right? They just sell things, and there's always a way to make extra money. Well, that's what these gentlemen did. They started businesses, and those businesses ended up taking off. And even though they always kept their job, I mean, these are guys who kept their job right up until the end, but they managed to keep those businesses going as well. And, another thing that could be a business might be rentals. Maybe you have an apartment and maybe you rent out a room. Maybe you have a house and you rent out the garage for someone to do storage. Maybe you end up buying another property and renting it out, but it creates a little income. And even though you have a job, it ends up being a business on the side. For these gentlemen, first they saved by being good with money, frugal, cheap, call it what you will. Then they started a business while keeping their job. And the third thing that they both did, like clockwork, was take some of the proceeds from their job as well as their business and then start to invest it. So I know what you're thinking. You're like, well, you started a business. Isn't that the investment? Isn't that what you're putting your money into? Sure, but once that starts to make money, you now can create another pillar of income called your investments. And you can do that by either putting it into another business or you can just put it to work. Investments, I always look at them as something I do, like I take a little bit of my profit and I park it somewhere. I just park it somewhere. Hopefully it makes me a little money, whether it's making it on interest or whether it's making it through dividends from a stock or whether it's making it through a high yield savings. Maybe I've put it in a Roth IRA. That could be an investment. Maybe I have a 401k. That could be an investment. Maybe I've bought some stocks that I'm, putting to work in the market. That could be an investment. Stock-wise, I like dividend-paying stocks better than just a regular stock. And I also like precious metals. These gentlemen did this to a very high degree, and ultimately it was that third tier, it was those investments that sent them from 7 figures to 9 figures, because that's what I call making money while you sleep. They were able to do this at a extremely high rate of return. What I'm getting at is that first off, they were really good with their income. And people can call them cheap. People can say they were cheapskates. They could say they were overly frugal, and maybe they did always order the cheapest thing on the menu. But that was the underlying current that was always in the back of their mind that's just making them good with money. In other words, if I spend it, I don't have it. So they just thought differently right from the beginning. Remember, 3 people can have the same jobs, but if 2 out of the 3 are doing what everybody else is doing and one person's thinking a little different, they may end up with a little bit more money because they're applying the principles. You can have 3 people do the same thing and you can get 3 different results. True wealth comes most of the time from simply starting out by having a job, having a basic income, but then finding a way to put the money to work. And ultimately, of course, I want you to know that you want to have a balance in life. Maybe these guys were a little bit too tight with their money, right? Maybe a little too frugal. The whole point is once you work and you do have a little bit of a cushion, I've never seen a U-Haul full of cash being pulled behind a hearse. In other words, you can't take it with you. And of course, you want to leave some of it to do a lot of good in the world, maybe for your family and maybe for the public interest. So you want to do good with your money. But at the same time, if you're working hard and you have done the right things, then you want to find that balance. My name is Daniel F. Margasa. You are watching The Almost Criminal Millionaire. And if you enjoy learning about the topics of money, finance, and the health and wealth of your bank account, then please like and subscribe for more.